My name is Bridget Burns, and I run the University Innovation Alliance, which is a national consortium of large public research universities who are scaling up what works across the country to better serve low-income first-generation college students. Today we're going to be talking about how awareness prompted from data is leading to significant changes in behavior on college campuses. See, that's data, that's feedback, that's going to influence how they adjust my microphone. See, this is all very much real-world learning. Before we kick off, though, I want to first start by asking the audience who y'all are. How many of you are educators? Okay, great. How many of you are from the edtech entrepreneur space? And venture capital? All right, we'll be wanting to talk to you later. Great, so any others that I haven't included? Workforce? All right, welcome. So that gives us a sense of where we might drive this conversation. First, I want to begin by introducing our panelists. Right to my right is Vince Kellen, who is the Senior Vice Provost and CIO at the University of Kentucky. He's also a senior consultant and at the Cutter Consortium. His area of expertise is the linkage between business strategy, information, technology, and knowledge. Welcome, Vince.
Thank you.
And then immediately to his right is Fred Singer, who is the CEO of Echo 360, Active Learning, and a career entrepreneur and internet pioneer. He recently wrote an article that prompted this panel, which we're going to hear first from him, giving us a little bit about that article, which is around what higher ed can learn from Fitbit. To his right is Perry Sampson, who is the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of Atmospheric Science at the University of Michigan. He's an expert in the field and a frequent speaker on the topic of improving student engagement through creative uses of technology. And to his right is no stranger, Dr. Timothy Renick, who is the Vice President, Vice Provost at Georgia State University and Chief Enrollment Officer, which is the only institution in the country who has eliminated race, ethnicity, and income as a predictor of outcome. And much of that is due to their extensive use of predictive analytics and use of data. So we have some folks in the field here who have done it, who've used it, and we also have some folks who are really in the field with a variety of different institutions who can give us lessons learned from a wide range of institutions. So let's first start by talking to Fred. This whole panel came about because of this article you wrote. Can you give us a little sense about the article itself for those who haven't read it, and what your point was and kind of how you come at this work?
Sure. Hi, everyone. First, let me just start with how I came by writing it. My career started actually in the newspaper industry back in the 1990s, the Washington Post, and I was one of the early guys at AOL and then Yahoo and SoftBank. So I've spent 20 years disrupting industries. About a decade ago, I decided I wanted to get involved with education, and I took a role that was the opposite of the one I've had my whole life. So I'm usually the outsider pushing to change the industry. This time I was actually working within higher ed, trying to give them the tools and platforms to be able to support. And so what I want to talk about Fitbit is really kind of this reverse disruption. It's different from, it's a different way of thinking about how Silicon Valley, we'll use in quotes, typically thinks about changing an industry. And at the core, in my view, having watched a number of industries, that big data is really an important, interactivity and big data is really at the center of it. Normally, when you listen to entrepreneurs pitch, what they're generally saying is the following. I have this amazing piece of technology. It's amazing, trust me. If the faculty would get out of the way and let my technology do great things, I'll revolutionize education. And the implicit assumption is that the technology is more important than the faculty. It's my view in the article, it's what I talk about, is in fact faculty and learning is really difficult. And all the research shows that. And so the role of technology in this industry is actually to support the faculty. The Fitbit analogy is really looking at the idea that with Fitbit, the technology doesn't actually change you. It simply makes you aware of what you're doing. I want to walk 10,000 steps. Fitbit doesn't make me walk 10,000 steps, but it does tell me every day. So suddenly, I start to change my behavior based on the awareness of the data. So the notion that what you measure is what you fix. So the idea here is that in what higher ed can learn from Fitbit is that when you actually look on a college campus, one of the places where there's virtually no measurement is in the classroom. So we have a lot of data on campus, and we have some amazing institutions here and leaders talking about it. But when you go into the classroom, what are the students actually doing? Are they taking notes? Are they asking questions? Are we able to measure it? And it's ironic because in a research-based institution, the place where there's the least amount of data to do research is in the classroom. So I started a company called Echo 360 that's an instructional platform. But the basis of the article is that what higher ed can learn is that where you can measure, you can improve. And that maybe the best way of using data is not to disrupt education, but to study the habits of good teachers and use that data to begin to build better models of pedagogy that allow you to identify students and be more successful. So in this case, big data is disrupting, not by eliminating, but by actually following what's going on. And so that was the basis of the debate in the article. And so that's what that started off. Great.
So how many of you are actually wearing some device that's giving you that kind of real-time feedback right now? All right. That's helpful. So we have a sense. Yeah. Anyone, any double wearers out there? I saw someone wearing an Apple Watch and a Fitbit, and I was like, that's pretty intense. So let's dive a little bit deeper in here and get a sense of the other perspectives on the panel. So Perry, how do you come at this work? Give us a little sense of where you're at with the data analytics adoption spectrum and what you're learning.
Well, I've been teaching at the University of Michigan for 37 years now, and over that time I've known very little about my students. But being a meteorologist, I know, for example, I made a website called the Weather Underground that some of you probably know. And in there we have data that we collect from the field where people can plug in their homegrown weather system, and from that we collect the weather data. And that's interesting, but what you want is the forecast for the weekend. Likewise, in the classroom, are there ways that I could now measure things happening in my classroom that are not going to come from the LMS, not going to come from the learning management system? What are the students doing during class, and how would that information help me help the students? Or how would it help the students understand what they don't understand? And based on that, we started using this technology which does that, which works inside the LMS that students can use in the classroom. They can take notes. They can ask questions. They can answer my questions. They can indicate when they're confused. I call it the WTF button. What's Terry talking about? And then this way, this data is being collected. It really increases the amount of engagement in the class because you're giving the students more opportunities to participate. But more important for me is this collecting data on what students are doing. And I've been able to use that in my class. So it's kind of like a Fitbit. I'm using it in my class in that by the third week of class, I can already predict who's going to fail my course. Now what do I do? And that's why I'm here. I don't know what to do at this point. There must be some interventions which are smart to do, but I'm just a meteorologist. I'm trying to figure out how can I connect with advisors, how can this data be given to the students so that they, by just with like the Fitbit, they would see what they're doing, and hopefully that would kick them in the butt to make some changes in their own life.
All right, so let's take it even further to those who've used data to actually enact broad change across the campus. So both Tim and Vince have done some big stuff on your campuses. Tim, can you give us a sense of how you use data to transform your institution and what you could say would be an allegory for what you've learned from Fitbit, I guess?
Yeah, we've gone through some big demographic changes at Georgia State. We have about 60% of our students are low income, 63% are non-white. And so we needed to change in order to better serve the students. Clearly, the same old rules wouldn't suffice. So what we did about 5 years ago is look at our data. We tracked 10 years worth of Georgia State grades, 2.5 million grades, 140,000 student records, to try to identify historically what students had done in the past as far as academic decisions that correlated to their likelihood of dropping out. And we found about 800 things that were statistically significant, and now we track all 800 of those things for every student every day. So as we update our student information systems every night, we're tracking for each individual student. We have 50,000 students at Georgia State now. For each student, each of those 800 things, if an alert goes off, it goes directly into the hands of an advisor, and there's some kind of mediation within 48 hours. I think the most interesting thing we've discovered from this system And it has been scaled very large. So last year we had 49,000 one-on-one interventions between our advisors and students that were prompted by alerts from the system. Is that the student's behavior really does change just by the knowledge of the information that they previously didn't have access to. So we thought that going into this, we might have to create new policies. For instance, if a student is in a major where their early grades predict that they have a very low chance of succeeding in that major, do we need to create an academic policy that says, well, if your chances of graduating are below this level, then you've got 2 semesters warning and then you have to change? No, because by engaging the students with the data, we found that their behavior changes quite naturally. Similarly, with regard to registration, we're tracking every bit of registration and beginning to identify when students sign up for courses that don't apply to their degree program. Are we going to have to create some rules about, especially if you're a low-income student with limited resources, you can't choose to take a bunch of additional courses that don't apply to your degree program? And the answer was no, because once we got the students the information that these particular courses didn't apply, what we found in mass by the thousands, the students changed their behavior. And they began saying, okay, I'm not going to take that course, I'll take another.
What about you, Vince? I know that you were in a singing competition recently. That's why your voice is probably rough, so I won't make you talk too much.
No, I've been so excited about this topic. I've been talking about it nonstop. I've lost my voice. So, well, at University of Kentucky, we put together a technical infrastructure that now brings all data from all student systems all into one very high-speed in-memory analytical platform. And in the last few months, we've worked with Echo 360 and Canvas to get real-time streaming data representing all of that interaction data real time. And so now we're starting to think about how can we use that real-time data for maybe in-class and in-class activity sort of feedback in it. And that's where that notion of the real-time comes in. I think that's extending that Fitbit concept now to take into that real learning situation. So I think for us, it's really been getting all known systems we have integrated tightly, doing all the predictive modeling that you need to do there. But now how can we get deeper into the classroom and give poking and intervention and nudging to students in the classroom? That's hard work. That's a faculty at a time. We're only working with about a handful of leading faculty who are doing some very beginning baby steps in this. But I'm bullish, and I think this is going to be a more common approach down the road.
We can hope. Fred, you work with institutions around the country and outside the United States. Give us a sense of how broad this is being used, because I know that data is like the hot, sexy thing, but there's a lot of hot, sexy things that are just perceived as a plug and play and are not really going anywhere in higher ed. So can you give us a sense of like how widely felt and how far is this level of use of data in the field?
I think we're in the first or second inning, and I think probably to understand how data is being used, I would say you have to break it up between profile and more summative data and kind of behavioral data. So as you think about data in the Fitbit analogy, where I think there's a lot of activity right now is beginning to build these models about who a student is and what they're doing, and based on who they are and what they're doing outside the classroom, you can have predictive. And I think that part of the big data chain is much further along. I think that the secondary piece is the behavioral data. So take 2 students. One has a profile that's likely to not graduate, and you want to intercede because of their profile, whatever, income, whatever it is. The other is, I don't understand Bernoulli's principle, I need actual specific help. And so I think where we're seeing the big move now, we're starting to see the move now is towards adding the behavioral data to the profile data, and then you actually have the full system. And then that's what puts pressure on, okay, well, how's data shared and how are you able to put that together? So I think we're much further along on who the student is and therefore the likelihood you're going to be there. I think there's a huge gap in terms of the behavioral data. And the best way to think about it is on Amazon. Can you imagine Amazon running a website where they don't know where you're clicking ever? They're just guessing. And that's kind of where we are right now. So we're still in the very early stages. But that also is, in my experience, is where the big disruption, the big benefits occurs when you can really get into that small data.
So let's talk about that beginning stages for both, I guess Vince, Perry, and Tim. Can you give us a sense of when you first start out? So there are a lot of campuses who are thinking about adopting predictive analytics, who are thinking about going with Echo. What are the first few steps that you think were essential to being successful? Because a lot of people think it's just, oh, well, just buy the app. And that's obviously not going to be what works. So for you, Tim, what was the first step that you think set you on the path to success?
Yeah, I think a twofold process. One is for these data systems to work effectively, the data has to be in the right shape. And sadly, in post-secondary education, that's rarely the case. So big public universities like Georgia State have not historically done a good job of creating good, clean data. So that's task number one. Parallel to it is the cultural task. I'll say one of the first reactions the faculty had when we talked about this tracking of every student on a daily basis and feeding them information about predictive analytics and what they were most likely to succeed in was, oh, we're going to dumb down, the whole university. That the phrase I remember from a faculty member was, our system was moving students to easier majors. Because if what you're doing is advising them where they have the greatest chance to succeed, then presumably this would lead them all to be, and I'll let you, not me, fill in what that easy major might be, but they'll all end up that major and not the tough majors. What's interesting again is that when we've done this at scale, we've been 4 years now, we've had over 200,000 interactions with students based upon this data. Just the opposite has been the case. The two fastest growing majors at Georgia State are computer science and biology, and just about every faculty member would agree that those are not among our easier majors. The reason is because of all this incremental data coming along has actually changed behavior early enough for many of these students that where in the past they would have flunked out, I'm going to be pre-med, but I come into the university with poor math skills. Now I'm going to be pre-med, I come into the university with poor math skills. But there are data points that are being triggered early on, as early as the second week of the semester, and some of these issues are getting remediated, and I'm being directed to, here's the help I need and so forth. And at scale, that's beginning to have major impacts upon the flow of students and their success in what we regard to be some of the toughest majors at Georgia State.
Perry, what about you? When you first started getting some data about your classroom, what data was most important for you and what data changed your behavior the most?
my behavior. Well, in the classroom, by collecting these data together, and it was data from Echo 360, which is the in-class data, I was able to marry it with the data from the student information system and data coming from our LMS, which was Canvas. And started looking at all these data together, plus some surveys I sent to the students to see what if anything, am I doing that has any impact on students' grades. And through the course of some research, discovered that there are certain things that students do during class that very much indicate who is going to succeed during class. So the hard part, as Tim says, is coupling these data together because they're messy. Coming out of Echo and coming out of every other source, they all have different glitches in them, and you have to figure out a way to marry them together and then anonymize them so that you're making a sandbox. And I encourage universities, colleges to think about ways to take these data and collect them from your LMS and from your student information system. And if you have vendors that aren't giving you your data back for free, fire them. Make sure you have all your data in one place, make a sandbox, and then make it available to your researchers on campus to understand how is it that learning and grades are in any way related to student behavior, first of all. And second of all, open it up also to the student entrepreneurs on campus. If you have that data set and the names are redacted from it, there's an opportunity there to build sort of the next generation of tools. What we found, and this is one of those does statements, is simply the more you can do formative assessment in the classroom. Ask them questions about content and understand who's getting it right and wrong during the class. That's going to tell you a great deal about who's going to do well in the class. Duh. If they get the questions right during class, they're probably going to do well in the exams. But we just ignore that data all too often. So we should be collecting that data, building it into these early warning systems, and letting the students know what percentage of the questions are they getting right, and how does that compare to the rest of the class?
Vince, if people want to replicate what's going on at the University of Kentucky, what advice do you give them as the first few steps that you've learned from, or what walls did you bump into that you now know about that you can alert others to?
Order a lot of Kentucky bourbon. Well, the first thing we learned is the data will tell you things, right? And oftentimes it will point out that a cherished belief is not true. And so I cannot tell you how many times we've had to talk other administrators off of a ledge because their cherished belief was found not to be true. And that takes time. Some get it right away. Some are in deep denial about what the data say. And so the first thing we've had to do is protect against data denial by massive transparency and democratization of the data. And it works like this. Dean or department chairs and data denials used to ruling the roost on their data makes a claim. 5 other people in the room open up their laptops, look at our analytical system and say, not so, not so, not so. And so good average people who have access to the data can come to their own conclusions about the data. And that's been extremely helpful, is building that community of what I call a data analysis community in a very open, democratized way. That's important. It just takes one very top executive to want to have a self-fulfilling prophecy come true to kill all of this.
Does anyone want to react to that?
Well, maybe I'll give an example of one of these myths that has been debunked by tracking the data more carefully. Talk about prerequisites and prerequisite grades. Our accounting faculty, for instance, had for years and years a requirement that to take an upper level accounting course, you needed a minimum grade of a C in your lower level math courses. Well, we ran the data. If you actually got a C in your lower level math course and then went on to take upper level accounting, your chances of getting an A or B in the accounting course were under 20%. So that's not really good intelligence we're giving to the students about, progression, and we're supposedly the ones who know our systems and know the way through it. Turns out, as you ran the data, that the students on average needed closer to a B+ in order to have an 80% chance of getting an A or B in their accounting course. So again, let's feed the students this information. It doesn't mean that we don't have accounting majors anymore. It does mean that we have a lot of accounting majors who are on their own willingly going through tutoring or taking extra math courses before they attempt the upper level accounting and saving themselves wasted credit hours and wasted dollars and times in the process.
I think the other thing too is it's not just what the data is, it's the time in which you get it. So for example, if you are worried about if you're worried about retention, by the time you have the midterm and you know there's a problem, it's too late. So one thing that data now exposes is within the first couple of weeks, you know whether students are actually doing the work. Are they answering the questions in class? So the idea that we can have much smaller chunks to look at. And again, putting it in the context of industry, this is just really normal behavior. No one runs a website where you don't know day-to-day what's happening. And so this is partly bringing in some traditional methods, but timing is also as important as the actual data sets you get. And the other thing I'd say is you never know ahead of time which data is going to be important. Is note-taking correlated to grade in these courses? You don't know. Is attendance? None of that. Those are things that you can develop as you're able to see what comes out.
I've got a real-world example where I've got 195 students in my class this semester. And in week 3, I forecast that 17 of them are going to fail based on how their behaviors in the first 3 weeks. So not knowing anything about intervention or pedagogical theory, I decided the best thing I could do is invite each of those 17 out for coffee. And in the process, at least hear what's going on in their lives. Maybe we're working extra jobs, they don't have some time. There's a whole range of stories that I heard from these students. And for half of those 17 students, I also showed them the data from previous semesters, the relationships between attendance and grades, the relationship between note-taking and grades, et cetera. And I don't have the results yet, but what I've done is looked at how did their behaviors change then simply by meeting them and having coffee. And second, meeting them, having coffee, and showing them the data. Hypothesis is that those who showed, first of all, meeting with them might have humored them, and they got a cup of coffee out of it. Those who also saw the data ought to be kicked in the butt and say, yeah, I should change the way I'm behaving. But I haven't got the results yet. But this is the thing you can do when you have data like this, is you can do an intervention in week 3 and then see what happens in weeks 4, 5, and 6. And you can have almost instant feedback yourself about how my intervention is working. How valuable am I in the classroom?
So let's dive into that discussion about advisor-facing, student-facing, administrator-facing. Where do you find, Fred, more broadly, you create a product that can be used by the faculty, by administrators. Where do you find it to be the most important in terms of, who is the user? And how do you make those decisions? How do you guide institutions who are about to try and make a call? If they're going to make one move for data, is it going to be for this audience or this audience or this audience?
Well, I think today, so first of all, the systems are incomplete. So our Fitbit analogy is only partially complete today in higher education. So, today the data is usually between the student and the faculty, or it's profile data where it's being used by the administration. And there's a whole issue about getting the data from our system into the LMS, into any of the data analytics programs. And so, first of all, the systems today aren't connected, and that's a problem, and that's got to change because higher ed will really benefit from it. The second thing is, even on the advisory work, is that, obviously the next step that's going to happen is if you have a watch and you're not walking 10,000 steps, then at some point someone says, well, gee, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a program to help? In this case, you can hook in OER, educational materials, you can hook in advisory. None of those systems are in place yet. That's where it's going. And so part of what the Fitbit article was about was that we have pieces of the things in place. We're still in the first or second inning. It should hook into advisory. It should include real time. But by the way, we also need to know what type of student it is. And so, what they're doing, the folks here are doing things that are on the cutting edge, and that's why they're interesting to listen to, but we're still quite early in the ability to have real ecosystems of data that work and drive it like it is in the private sector.
Great. Vince, you want to react to that?
Yeah, I think this notion of the Fitbit is kind of interesting because next generation of these can start to measure more interesting biometrics. And one measure I'm interested in is heart rate variability. How many of you do HRV training physically? It's also a measure of whether you're overloaded mentally or not paying attention. It's a real-time measure, and there's no reason in the future a student couldn't have one of those on and have the computer display adapt to that and start to make decisions on what content to show next. We're not the first to think of this. The gaming industry has been long interested in this topic, but we're going to get close to the technology really enabling it.
Well, let's go a little further into the taboo nature of the ethics of this and what data is in data jail, what folks feel like they have a right to make inferences from, or just kind of how they negotiate this relatively new field. Perry, do you have any guidance as a faculty member who's seeing information that's kind of overwhelming at times and you might not have a handbook to go to?
Yeah, I first of all, I'm fully IRB compliant, shouldn't be filming this. I do ask my students on day one, I tell them, like, I'm going to put a probe in you, I'm going to measure everything you're doing this semester. If you have a problem with that, click the button no, and I'll ignore your data. And I had one student out of 195 this semester who opted for that. I go the step further, and they know that my class is out there. So I ask them every day in class, for example, on the kinds of questions you can ask are image-based, among others. And one of the questions is, how do you feel? So the x-axis is physically from poor to great, and the y-axis is emotionally from poor to great. And the students every day put a dot on that graph of how they feel on that day. And I mine that data over the course of the semester to see what relationships there are between their physical emotional state and the grades. And you could all sit there and guess right now what the results are. Their physical state is, I thought it'd be related to the grayness in Ann Arbor in the middle of winter, but it turns out not. The only thing that the physical state is related to is the minimum temperature in Ann Arbor. The colder it gets, the more miserable they feel. On the other hand, their emotional state actually predicts their grades. Holy cow. How had I ever known that before in my lifetime? So if emotional state is predicting their grades, should we be collecting that? Last day of class, I asked them, here's the results of the study. First of all, how comfortable are you telling me about your emotional state? And they said, geez, we're on Facebook, get over it. Okay, second, then what would you hope that I would do with that data if I knew that you're having an emotionally challenged period? Remember, I'm a meteorologist. And they came back, and I gave them a list of ideas. One is to tell them about resources on campus, and they said, yeah, fine. Should I tell your parents? Are you nuts? Should I tell your advisor? Are you really nuts? And what they all wanted to the person was coffee. They wanted to sit down with coffee and tell me what the issues were in their life, thinking probably that I would be empathetic to them. But the point is that there's lots of other data that affect their learning that we aren't knowing about. Emotional things are going on, stresses with money are going on, things that we don't collect and aren't easily collect. I mean, on your campuses, for example, we probably know where the students are all the time. We know what access point they're talking to. We have that data on most campuses. To what degree should we have access to that? How important is that? There's a lot more data which probably affects students' learning that we don't know yet. And until we have the relationships, until we can write the papers to understand what these relationships are and offer good guidance, it's still going to be very researchy, and we're a long way from making that happen.
Just going to add, I think this point about emotional state, you'd never think of asking that question. The point is you do not know ahead of time which data is important. This isn't super complicated. It's not that hard to ask, in other words. And so a lot of the data that will make a big difference, that can have impact right away, are not things that require 5 years. They're actually doing it. But again, once you get in the mindset that everything could potentially be a variable, your approach to how you think about it, and again, going back to the Fitbit article, it just changes the way you think, even if it's evolutionary, not revolutionary.
Tim, have you had any experience around the ethical questions that people raise?
Yeah, there are some challenging issues here. Again, our faculty kind of led the charge initially against some of what we were doing, saying, to put it in an academic way, this was creepy, big brotherish, and so forth. We have allowed students to opt out of the daily tracking that I've been describing. And in 4 years, almost 4 full academic years, we haven't had a single student opt out. In fact, the most common reaction, we have iPads set up as they exit the advising center, and so they can fill out anonymous comments. The most common reaction when we first went live with this new system was, where was it when I first enrolled at the university? Because this is all kinds of information I need but I didn't have. So there hasn't been a lot of resistance from our students, similar to what Perry says. This is a generation that is used to having their life displayed publicly and so forth. On the other hand, there are some real moral challenges here. For one thing, and this is a disanalogy to the Fitbit, when we went live with this tracking, we actually hired 40 new advisors because we believed that every bit of this information, at least as we were first going live, because we were one of the first schools in the country to use this kind of data, had to be mediated by somebody. So we didn't want a student, picking up their phone or looking at their watch and saying, oh, I dreamed of being a doctor, but there's some red light going off that says I can't be pre-med anymore, or my risk factors are too high and so forth. So we made a commitment that all of those conversations would be mediated by a professional who was going to be trained to talk with the students about these issues. Now, as we're 4 years in, we've begun to slowly take some steps in the other direction. We're now piloting an app that will deliver via pop-up messages some of the most basic information. If a student hasn't registered yet for the semester, or they register and they're not in the right courses and so forth, that kind of information. But it's taken some time for us to figure out how students would react and what is the right way to present it, and how not to get results that would be counter to everything that we had imagined when we launched the system in the first place.
So let's talk about the next phase, or do you want to react to that?
Well, I'm going to put a little counter spin on that. I think institutions will vary on how they think about this. Many institutions require the student to show up in class. Why? So the instructor can track them. Same instructors don't want to track them when they're online. Really? I mean, just because we go digital doesn't mean we go blind. So I don't like compromising the quality of the digital experience just because we got, as adults, hang-ups about the data. Yet in the class, that same instructor can collect a whole lot of data in their brain and not do unethical things with it. So I think we're holding the technology to a much higher standard than we hold the regular classroom to, and I think that's a mistake. 2, our paneling of students year over year has shown they want the data, they want you to do good things with the data. They don't have a problem. Do good things with the data, don't hurt me. The adults have problems with it. I think that gap is a problem. There's a gap between what the teachers think, and it's probably been there, that gap's been there since the days we walked to school 3 miles, right, in the snow.
Poor you.
And so that's been there. So I think that the technical issues, there's other industries that have dealt with this. The healthcare industry has dealt with this for quite a while. And I like that model of caregivers. You've got multiple caregivers providing care. Each caregiver needs the information to provide the maximum care. So when we get discussions about, gee, well, this caregiver should not be seeing this information. Well, they should see the information they need to give the care they need to give. Healthcare world has models. So in our system, we anonymize the data. We have all sorts of ways to ferret out security. It's turned out between the faculty and the students, we've got to do far less of that than we realized.
So what advice would any of you give to an administrator or president who is interested in going down this route, but is getting that knee-jerk, age-old reaction of, no, we can't because of some antiquated interpretation of FERPA, or some, that's a silo, that box of data can't touch this box of data. What advice would you give? Because Fred, I feel like you probably deal with this at a million campuses. Those seem to be those are the questions that hold people back from actually pulling the trigger and making any change.
Well, I think all the systems that I can only speak for our system. Systems we've developed, we've been doing it for a decade. And so, the core privacy requirements, we deal with up front. I think, in general, I think the issue is that on campuses, you don't have to go whole hog right out of the gate. So generally what we see is you start with a couple of classrooms, or you start with a particular faculty, and you get going and you collect the basic data and you get basic results. If you want to get to where Tim is, or Vince, or that, it takes a while to build up to that. But that doesn't mean you can't have a glide path. It doesn't mean every single faculty member has to go at the same time. You can take your top 10% and focus on them, because in most campuses, it really is important for someone on their campus to validate that it works. So what I'd say is, I'm not sure, Bridget, I'm not sure the biggest block are those requirements. I think the biggest block is culture. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's all about faculty feeling comfort with it. How do you deal with, I think those are just bigger issues on most campuses. So can you give them any instructional support? Can you allow the leaders to do it and learn from somebody else? And I think that's really the starting place of it. But you can get immediate results. We have people getting, Indian River just, got 20% increase in the remediation programs just by doing basic things. So there's a lot that can be done right away before you get to the really fancy stuff. But it's all part of this Fitbit piece where you begin to measure and you focus on it. And the more you do, you'll get better results. But I don't feel like it has to be an all or nothing.
Right.
So one of the things I notice is that there's a lot of tinkering in silos, a lot of campuses who are making progress, but in general, if you look across the country, nearly 5,000 universities, it's relatively stagnant when you talk about innovation spreading. So part of this challenge is that administrators are kind of having to reinvent the wheel and run into the same walls over and over, because things don't scale. We don't really, we use conferences and white papers to diffuse ideas. So what can we do to try and take the lessons that you all are learning to make it so it's easier for someone else to try and take the ball and run with it and not have to recreate the failure you've already experienced?
I'll just jump because I feel passionate about this. Technology and education are no longer two separate silos. Technology is absolutely critical to supporting the pedagogical process. And so the biggest problem you have is when IT and academic goals aren't unified. They're kind of, one's a service center. That's the first thing. So whenever you're building your committees, make sure that those two are together. When you're evaluating any technology, ask yourselves the basic questions. Does it drive outcomes? Does it help whatever my academic objectives are? I think that's really absolutely critical. And the second thing I'd say is, it's a really good point, Bridget, is the best, most industries have a hard time experimenting. Higher ed has, in my opinion, has very little problem experimenting. It has a hard time scaling because it's so naturally decentralized and independent. And so you have to find a way where you can take grad courses or some piece of your campus where you can take something from an experiment to some scale much more quickly. You can develop real partnerships with a few people that you feel comfortable with. Those two things are missing from what I normally see in other industries. And so from my perspective, that's what I see. But
Yeah, ironically, higher ed doesn't take enough responsibility for doing the one thing that we should be best at, which is research. I mean, we're all trained faculty members via Ph.D. programs and so forth to do a certain approach to truth and truth finding. And yet when it comes to some of these areas, we've been very, very deficient. In the area of advising, which I've been talking a lot about this afternoon, you know, we looked at the federal registry, it's called the What Works Clearinghouse, for what kind of articles have been published that show the effectiveness of academic advising in higher education. Now, almost every school across the country has academic advising offices and academic advisors, so there must be a good body of literature. There's one article out there. So part of the goal of the University Innovation Alliance that Bridget referred to earlier has been to pull together some of these big research universities. We're talking about Georgia State's joined by Arizona State, Texas, Ohio State, Purdue, Michigan State, Central Florida, and so forth, really large research institutions. And all of us, all 11 of us, are engaged in a significant project over the next 4 years to experiment with predictive analytics in proactive advising, to create controlled studies of over 10,000 students over a multi-year period to look at what kind of impact this has. Because if we don't do it, then who is going to provide that kind of analysis and research and so forth? There needs to be a model where it's not just single institutions standing up one by one, but it's multiple institutions coming together and beginning to come up with conclusions that cross the institutional differences that exist between different state lines, different policies, and so forth for individual campuses.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If you look in the medical world, they got clinical trials and a whole process for bringing new interventions to market. Now, that's very heavy and long, but we have practically nothing outside of little silos of research. I think it would be great for the academy writ large to have something like that, a lightweight means to publish and share what they learn very quickly and easily. It's first innings. No vendors figured this out. You know, how many of you have kids in college? Have you figured out what makes them successful? No. So, I mean, you know, if you can't handle your own kids, how are we going to handle 30,000? It's very early, so it's going to take the entire academy to kind of share in that knowledge quickly.
So let's, yeah, go
I just
ahead.
got one more point. The other thing that's really interesting is if you want to do anything in the classroom, generally you have a window in August or September. And so if you miss that window, maybe you're lucky you can get a window in January. So the testing process is almost on a 12-month cycle. And so the other question is, can you set up with, again, faculty that are comfortable, things where you can test things in micro. So maybe through the course of a year you can test a couple of classes that can lead in. And so again, the pace at which you can iterate, because no one knows ahead of time what works, is another barrier, and that's another thing to think through. That's a small thing, but may allow you to actually test and experiment much quicker than somebody else.
So Perry, I was going to ask you about how this wave of data and technology is going to influence learning.
I'm sitting here as the elephant in the room because the real problem in this whole system is me. It's the instructor. You know, the students are all into it. They don't mind sharing their data. They would love to see Fitbits for education, I'm sure of it. And my students on surveys actually said they would. But the issue I have is trying to convince colleagues to try new things in the classroom pedagogically, much less even technologically. How do you move the faculty who aren't always hired because of their skill in teaching to teach what? We all walk into the classroom wanting to teach well, but we have so many other responsibilities that trying to do new things in the classroom is maybe low on the totem pole. So one of the bright things that ECHO has done, for example, is we took all these tools for gathering students' notes and gathering their attendance in class and their interactions in class, and they built it all into PowerPoint. So now you're used to teaching class with PowerPoint. You just use your PowerPoint as you always did, and you're able, with one button click, you share your slides with the students. They can do their thing where they can see your slides, they can take the notes, and all the data is being collected, and you never have to leave PowerPoint. You can build questions and videos into PowerPoint, and I can conduct my class now. It's so much more interactive than it ever has been before. Plus, you click a button with this thing, and I can broadcast my class live. I've 100 seats in the classroom. My class has got 195 students in it. Many of them because the weather sucks in Michigan, will watch class from elsewhere, but it's still an interactive session where they can answer my questions, they can pose questions to me, they can tell me when they're confused, all this data is being collected, and I'm just using PowerPoint. So I'm trying to build this from faculty to faculty member by just demonstrating to them that you really don't have, it's not a big lift. You can change, you can increase your pedagogy without doing a whole lot more, and you're going to gain this whole selfie about what's happening in your class and understanding better how students are behaving, and hopefully it'll help give you evidence. So when Johnny walks up and says, "Perry, I'm trying so hard in your class," and I can pull up a little sheet, you're going, "Oh, no, you are not." But I can do it with evidence instead of just saying, work harder. No, work harder isn't going to cut it. You need to be able to say with some more directness, well, you probably need to do the following 3 things. Other students are doing those things, doing well in the class. It gives me more evidence to present to the students. Hopefully, I can be more informed when I try to get them to change their behaviors.
So going into that area where some faculty might have hesitation around data and analytics, Candace Teal gave a talk at South by Southwest, and she also, the Chronicles Relearning, wrote an article about her discussion that these algorithms are not neutral, that there are assumptions that are built in, and that's part of why faculty, that's what gives them the heebie-jeebies, is that they know that there are some fundamental assumptions that might be problematic. What can we do as an industry to try and open up that conversation so it is one where we can have a robust discussion instead of just assuming something is black or white or not allowed or allowed?
Well, on each campus, you got to kind of figure out how that conversation unfolds, because it's a very local thing. I think you just have to, first the assumption that the algorithm has an assumption, well, so do human beings. Faculty have their own biases in the classroom as well. The notion of how do you have a conversation about teaching on campus is interesting. I've been teaching at university since 1998. I learned more about teaching by being a ski instructor, where 50% of my time was on learning how to teach. We don't do it with faculty. So you've got to unwind this and say, we got to look at the faculty onboarding process, the promotion process, and we have to build the right and peel off the budget and the time so that the faculty can get that grounded, so that when you have the conversation, it's now a more common and informed conversation. So I think that's part of the way to get at that.
Any other reactions?
Well, we've talked a lot about Fitbit as an analogy here, and the assumption has been it's the student wearing the Fitbit, but I think increasingly we need to have Fitbits for faculty as well. Yeah. So the reality is that most faculty do not base their primary decisions in the classroom, in program design, in creating the curriculum and so forth upon evidence. They created upon, and I have a long-term faculty member myself, I will be the first to testify, we would go to faculty meetings and we'd mostly just sit around and make stuff up. You'd never sit there if you're designing a new program and say, well, what does the evidence show of student learning and what grade should we assign as a prerequisite grade? Well, let's look at the data and determine what grade a student needs in the prerequisite course to do well in the next level course. That almost never happens. It needs to happen. It needs to be the basis for the decision making that's occurring across the board. And the hopefulness of this whole panel is the fact that we are becoming more data literate, and as the data is falling into the hands of faculty, it is having that same kind of influence that it has upon the students. One quick example is, our nursing faculty couldn't be more caring about students, but it turned out that a lot of our nursing students at Georgia State were doing very poorly. And one reason why is once we showed them the data and we had a discussion about it, they had designed a program with a 2-year preliminary process that would weed out the students who would get into the nursing program versus those who did not. That might work well with some students. When you're dealing with mostly low-income students, they can't afford to pay for 2 years to find out they've been weeded out. Even if they're doing very well by academic standards, they don't have the resources to start again after 2 years of coursework and so forth. So by sharing that data with our nursing faculty, they created a new structure for our nursing program. And now we have a much more streamlined entry process for the students getting into the program and so forth. That we need to replicate across higher ed.
I think what's really hopeful is that, again, sometimes revolutions are evolutionary. Nothing we've been talking about here is a revolution. We're talking about active or blended learning. We're talking about smarter measurement. We're talking about researching the very thing that we're doing. And so, you know, I think you can get dramatic increases in what's applicable, or I think has caught the attention of people about Fitbit, is it is not saying it's one type of approach. It's not saying that you have to intercede all the time. It is simply paying attention to the very things we do well, doing more of them, and again, and then starting to scale them. Because I think the big issue is not that there's not a lot of experimentation, but universities and colleges are not set up to scale, and they're not set up to scale across institutions easily. But if we do any of that, you're going to see, I think you see a revolution without having to you know, follow the traditional lines that we hear about.
Great. Are there any questions from the audience before we wrap up?
Can I just make one more comment? Because one of the pieces of data that came back that surprised me, and that advisors should know, is that the best way to predict a student's grade in my class or most classes is their incoming GPA. If their GPA is low, they're probably going to do poorly in my class. So I turned the question around and said, how is it that students with different incoming GPAs behave differently in class? And lo and behold, discovered that the students with the low GPA coming in, they're attending class maybe 20% less. They were answering questions about 15% less. They're getting the same number of questions right, which argues that maybe they have the same cognitive ability. They're taking 2 orders of magnitude fewer notes and 2 orders of magnitude less looking and reviewing after class. I mean, it's a dramatic differences in how these students are behaving in the classroom. And the issue may not be that they're cognitively less able, it's simply that somehow along the way they either don't have the motivation or don't have the study skills to understand how to be successful in school. The advisors ought to have access to that data, hopefully not the meteorologists in the room, but the advisors would know how to kick them in the pants and say, here's evidence about what you should do differently.
Great. So I don't see any questions. So let's do one last round. You get 30 seconds or less. What is the final piece of advice that you would give for campuses who are thinking about going down this road, or suggestions for the industry that you think would help us to take this to the next level? Tim, because you're first.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'll build on the last point about scaling, that we've got to come up with models in which what we do on individual campuses and then across campuses actually impacts the bulk of students rather than a small select group of students. So what does it take in order to change our behavior at a fundamental level? That's the only thing that's going to actually transform the outcomes in a significant way.
Perry?
Do it.
Okay.
I think if only one thing, make sure that the people who are helping you do this, that you have a cross-section of your campus. Do not let it be siloed technology, siloed academia. Make sure that they are thinking through the problem holistically and experiment, and then pick a few, but try to partner versus just trying to experiment endlessly. That's what happened to the newspaper industry and their classifieds, and it didn't work out so well. So at some point, you actually have to make bets, and you can't make bets if you actually don't have firsthand knowledge of what's going on.
Mankind is a teaching animal. We've been doing it since we've been Homo sapiens. Vendors, you're not going to figure it out quickly. You have some humility. Very rich, technocratic entrepreneurs, your experience isn't relevant. You need to be talking to the students who are not like you to get a sense of this. So everybody's got to have humility about this. We are consistently underestimating the complexity of this problem. And the frustration with that complexity is bubbling. It's not going to make it any better. You got to tackle the complexity. So have some humility when you go there.
All right, that's great advice. Well, thank you all for being here today. Thank you to our panelists. And hopefully you all can move forward with a little bit more insight about how to apply data to influence your campus's behavior down the road. So thank you.